It's October the 1st, 1907. A man shows up in Freud's office, lies on the couch, and with great difficulty tells him the following. He was serving in the army when the captain of his regiment told him about a torture involving rats that goes on in some distant country. After hearing this, he's plagued by obsessional thoughts, compulsions, and rituals which revolve around the idea, or warding off the idea, that the same torture might befall his father and the woman he loves. What does Freud make of this? Freud encouraged his patient, Ernst Lanzer, to talk around it. Tell me about your life, tell me about your family, tell me about their lives. Rather than getting hung up on the rat torture story and trying to convince Ernst that it was a negative or incorrect thought that needed to be gotten rid of, Freud encouraged free speech. Tell me anything that comes to mind, even if it seems irrelevant, trivial, or embarrassing, Freud said. And what came to mind, for Ernst, was money. Not an obvious connection perhaps, but Freud was listening carefully, and he noticed the association used the verbal bridge, raten, raten. What else did the captain tell you? Asked Freud. Ernst relates a small drama. He'd lost a pair of glasses and another pair had been delivered for collection in a nearby town. The captain told him that another man had paid some of the delivery costs for Ernst, so now Ernst should find him and pay him back. Another association to money. Tell me about your father, Freud encouraged. More associations followed, this time to a story of how his father, while also in the military, had lost a large sum of money gambling. And just like the situation with the glasses that Ernst found himself in, this debt was covered by a man who lent him the money to pay it back. A man who, mysteriously, Ernst wasn't sure was ever repaid. Oh, thinks Freud. And there was something else in Ernst's life that mirrored his father's. The romantic dilemma of whether to marry a woman who was rich or a woman who was poor. Ernst's father had faced the same dilemma before marrying Ernst's mother, who was far richer than he was. Freud was noticing something strange. The rat story was emerging as a nodal point, like the grain of sand around which an oyster forms its pearl, he says. It was as if Ernst and his father's lives were entwined around these problems of money, debt, and marriage. All seemed to be not just connected, but connected through this same element, rat. It was as if something was being transmitted generationally from his father, something that used, or was used by, this element, rat. And there was something in particular that bothered Ernst about what might have been transmitted from his father. Syphilis, that dreaded STD which blighted 19th and early 20th century society, rendering sufferers disfigured, disabled and insane, and which could be passed down to the infant thanks to the indiscretion of the parents. Syphilis was more than just a disease. It was a social stigma, the mark of immoral parents whose sins were transmitted to their children. For Ernst, rats had become linked associatively to his father through their shared ability to transmit disease. And so Freud noted down, rats signify fear of syphilis. Money and syphilis converge in rats. Ernst had often thought that the nervous troubles of his family might perhaps be due to his father having syphilis. Rat was like a master key to Ernst's problems, but at the same time it was really nothing more than a meaningless formula. Everything he was telling Freud, beginning with his horror of the rat story, appeared to be condensed into this term rat. Hence the name that Ernst would come to be known by in the famous case that Freud published in 1909, the Rat Man. What does this tell us about the nature of repression? We can see that some process is at work that goes beyond Ernst's conscious recognition and which operates using verbal bridges that link his different associations to the same subject. But can we say that Ernst has repressed anything in the sense of pushing it down? Not really. Instead, Ernst's case implies that repression isn't something we don't know, refuse to know, or bury deep within ourselves. Nor do we need to come up with some elaborate or outlandish interpretation to make sense of it. The master key is right there on the surface. If we think of the repressed as some horrific event or violent, primitive urge, we will miss what's on the surface. We will miss the very words that someone is using which tell us what's important for them, the uniqueness of their experience. This idea is sometimes lost today. Respecting the particular associations and listening carefully to the precise words someone uses to describe their experience, even if this takes time, gets forgotten in the haste towards understanding. Let's imagine Ernst goes to see a certain kind of psychologist today. What's the problem? What's the diagnosis? Let's see. There's anxiety, there's indecision, procrastination, self-doubt. Perhaps Ernst is even suffering from PTSD. After all, he heard about the rat torture from his captain in the army. Perhaps this has traumatized him. But Freud was not duped by the sensationalism of the rat torture story. His approach gives space for his patient to speak freely, respecting the fact that Ernst's words have weight. And in this space, another meaning emerges from within his patient's words, though with a significance that is at first unbeknownst to Ernst. The only thing that links all these associations is the term rat. This is how psychoanalysis works. Lie on the couch and start talking about anything that comes to mind, and it doesn't matter whether you think it's silly, irrelevant, rude, imprecise. If it's just a word, memory, image that comes to mind, all good. Say it. What Freud was looking for were not grand traumas or existential dilemmas, but just these nodal points, the points of intersection, connection, junction that characterize the unconscious. He called them switch words, like junctions or switch points in a network. What they showed him was that rather than being something hidden, the repressed is the same material, but with different connections. Repression acts in a highly individual manner, he wrote. Each single derivative of the repressed may have its own special vicissitude. When something is repressed, it means it establishes connections with other elements that are repressed, and so we have a network that's built out of unconscious elements. These networks of connections that characterize repression explain how the same idea can be both abhorred and venerated. Rats both horrify and fascinate Freud's patient. Now, this contradiction might be a sign of ambivalence in love relations, so that rats are just a battleground where the war between love and hate of the same person is fought out. The rat man's problem is that he's caught in the impossibility of this contradiction, the unbearableness of entertaining two mutually exclusive ideas. Again, it shows us, as we saw in part 1, how the repressed and the return of the repressed are the same thing, because we don't have to hunt and dig through layers of sedimented material to find something deeper down. It will be there on the surface. Nothing about rats is unknown to the rat man. When we say that something is unconscious, it means that it's metabolized or processed off-scene, so that when it comes back on stage, it's wearing different clothes. When it comes to human suffering, we tend to think that because feelings and emotions are so strong, that they must be the key to what's important. That if we want to study something, we should study our affective responses to thoughts, ideas, situations. Freud thought things were a little more complicated than that. We saw in part 1 that there's no such thing as repressed feelings. Feelings always get through. Instead, there's a split or separation between the thought and the feeling, between the idea and the emotion. They pursue different destinies. So what then is repressed? In his hunt for an answer, Lacan went slowly, carefully, back through Freud's text, reading in the original German. And the term that sticks out to him is Vorstellungsrepräsentanz. Freud uses it when he's describing this separation of thought from feeling. The first part, Vorstellung, is used by Freud's translator James Strachey to cover the English terms idea, image, or presentation. But what about that second part, Repräsentanz? Lacan picks up on the fact that what Freud is describing is not just the representation, not just the representative of the representation, but, as he translates it, that which takes the place of the representation. And this is crucial, because what Freud is describing, for Lacan, is the signifier. Freud's conception leaves no room for ambiguity, Lacan says. It is the signifier that is repressed, there being no other meaning that can be given in these texts to the word Vorstellungsrepräsentanz. Nothing is ever, nothing can ever be repressed, except signifying elements, as he puts it later on. It is in Freud, the word signifier is all that's missing. When Freud wrote of how the intellectual function is separated from the affective process, he was talking about the signifier. But that doesn't mean that the signifier is obliterated. Being repressed means it functions off stage. In Lacan's hands, the signifier becomes the primary organising element of the unconscious. So, poring back through Freud's case notes on the rat man, Lacan sees that rat is a key signifier for Ernst Lanzer. Rat is not like a word. It's not tied to any representational referent, any specific meaning. As a signifier, it reappears in different contexts that have nothing to do with one another. Situations that are linked only through the switch word, the nodal point, the signifier, rat. It doesn't mean anything, and if the repressed is unconscious, and it is the signifier that is repressed, as Lacan says, then the unconscious doesn't mean anything. This is a crucial point to understand in psychoanalysis. The unconscious is not trying to say or communicate anything. It's just an assemblage of signifiers into networks in which one signifier connects to other signifiers rather than to any given meaning or signification. This is how we arrive at Lacan's most famous formulation. The unconscious is structured like a language. When Lacan rereads the Ratman case, he sees that this signifier organises the Ratman's life, connecting to his family history as if transmitted generationally like a legacy. This is a very different model of psychology to the ones that we're used to in popular culture. But to explain why this term rat had such significance in Ernst's life, we'd need to understand his family history, because this history is transmitted in the term rat. If we just focused on the story of the rat torture, or just on the story of the lost glasses, we would miss entirely the significance of this transmission, the transmission of a problem, debt, love, disease, repeated from one generation to the next, and encapsulated in the recurrence of this term, rat. The same goes for all of us. It's not a unique feature of a mental disorder, it's a feature of life. Lacan's idea of the symptom is not just about suffering, it's about the peculiar, idiosyncratic configuration of your life. To possess an unconscious is not a privilege of neurotics, he says. There are people who are manifestly not overwhelmed by an excessive weight of parasitic suffering, since to be analysed is nothing different than knowing one's own history. Since to be analysed is nothing different than knowing one's own history. This is what psychoanalysis is about. It's radically personal, highly individual. It's not a 12-step program or a cookie-cutter workflow. It's a prolonged and careful examination not just of your own history, but that of your family, to understand the particular idiosyncratic way your life has come to be arranged. And this makes the aims of psychoanalysis pretty modest. All that we could expect, Lacan says, is that human dramas might be less confusing.